So, welcome back, everybody. We are at the edge of the mountains and still looking for water, and and it's amazing to me how many things in this book are so relevant for us today. When I first started reading Canoeing the Mountains, we were not in COVID land. We did not have all the racial violence going on right now in our country, at least not to the extent that it's happening at the moment. And it was really hard to visualize for me what this looked like. And then suddenly, here we are thrown off the map. And I think that's made it easier for all of us to understand what going off the map looks like. Bolsinger talked about VUCA times in chapter 16, I think. And so we're going to watch a video now that talks about church in these VUCA times. And I know some of you have seen this, but I think it's a really good thing for us to think about as we are moving forward. Thanks, Deb.
Sure.
I really like the statement on the last slide that Jake Morrill used. Changed people change people. And throughout this series, we are becoming changed people, and we are learning about online ministry and how important it is. And the other thing from this video that really strikes me is the pathways, because the pathways not only speak to this leadership lesson that we're learning in Canoeing the Mountains, but it also speaks to our season with our priest in charge. And we really, we need to figure out what those pathways are and what they mean to us. And so I just thought that was a really good way to start this session. So chapters 14 and 15, it's the end of exploration. Lewis and Clark found the ocean, but all their assumptions and expectations that they held at the beginning of the journey, they figured out were wrong. I mean, the only thing that was right was there was an ocean on the other side, but everything else they thought, it was false. And one of the good things that they did that's really neat is they took this pathway of learning and they continued learning. They could have returned home the same way, but they didn't. They had that spirit of exploration, that spirit of adventure that I think we need to really tap into right now. And they split their core in half and they went home 2 different ways, so that then they had explored 3 different ways out to the Pacific. And I think that that's one thing that we need to remember. So that transformation was happening out there in that uncharted territory. God's really taking this church from Christendom and into uncharted territory to change us. We're not the little group of people in the churches separate from the world. And the church is not the building, especially. The church is not the building. We are not called to sit in our building and be good shepherd. We're called to go out into the world. So discovery and exploration, they don't really answer the questions. What they do is they make us consider new questions. So we have to think about things in more than one way to be part of that adaptive leadership and change that we're looking at. That third bullet point, change and learning come from listening to giving space and privilege to those on the margins. Boy, are we seeing that in the news right now. The people on the margins really are asking us to listen to them. They are really asking us to listen to them. We need to meet God where we are to follow him, but we have to cross cultures. If we're really going to follow, we've got to cross cultural boundaries. That's what Jesus did. How do we make our church more relevant in our community? And part of that is committing to collaborative leadership with unexpected partners. You know, all of us, when we think about forming a leadership team, usually we go to the people that we know are going to help us, that they're going to talk to us, that they're going to help us do the work, that we're not going to be standing there holding the bag, right? But that's not what we're being called to do. So another thing that really spoke to me in this section of the book is we have to cultivate a beginner's mind. And in that beginner's mind, where we're asking all the questions, no questions are stupid, no questions are unimportant or irrelevant. We have to take a step back and we have to start from the beginning. So in uncharted territory, we've got to rely on being able to question. We've got to rely more on relationships than on the rule book. So we need to focus on what God needs to do in us, in each of us, and us as a whole, so that he can use us for his mission. So in part of that, we're going to consider the larger themes of the book. Deb, if you would go to the next slide, we're going to ask some questions, and we're going to get your answers to all of these, but we're going to go one at a time. I want you to see the larger themes of the book and think about what we've learned, what still doesn't make sense, what is rubbing you wrong or creating resistance in you, and what do we need to begin to do differently? Now we're going to take those one at a time so that Deb can record our answers so that we can look back and see what's happening here. So what do you feel like you've learned as we've read and studied Canoeing the Mountains?
I think that it's all of us that need to do the work together, that we can't just rely on Father Gary or the vestry or any one individual, that we all need to get on board.
In the book, the metaphor is Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea, or however you would say her name. What I learned when I visited Montana was in the State House lawn, off to the side, not prominently in the middle, is a wonderful statue of Sacagawea. And there, and they also said it in the book, that because these men marched with a woman and a baby, they were not attacked by the Indians, because you didn't do a war party with women and a baby. And whether they knew that setting out or not, it became evident to them as they went on. What is incredible to me, given probably where they started mentally, especially Lewis and Clark, is that they did incorporate her as an equal member of their exploration. That is so hard for us to do. We don't really have skills to cross cultures in that complete and total way. That is where I think the effort is going to need to be, in how to allow true leadership for those that we have never embraced. I'm done.
Well, you know, to that end, they talked about in the book how Lewis and Clark listened to women and other minorities, and that they wouldn't have been successful if they hadn't. And they also talked about how women are already out in the community in ways that most men can't be. Being active with like PTA and play groups and stuff like that, even if it's in a short season of a woman's life when she's raising children, to be home for a couple of years. We have people that are out in the community, and we need to use that to our advantage. We don't have to reinvent that, because we do have people out there. And like I said, they use the women example, but I think we have other people that are in the community that we can access their knowledge, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, we can tap in, but I don't think we know how to actually surrender to that knowledge?
I don't think we know how to surrender to much.
No. How do I put that on the slide?
Anyway.
Anybody else? I think we have a lot of work to do, and the work we have to do after reading this book looks different than what I thought it looked like.
Can you say more?
Well, I just think that that Bolsinger has given us a snapshot of something very different than us going out, us as a vestry leadership team, whichever team of the church you want to talk about, and saying this is what we're going to do. That it's not about the powers that be making decisions and moving forward. And I guess you always know that you have to have buy-in to be able to have a group buy in and do something. But I think the way he talked about buy-in is a little different than how I would have looked at it before. Diane, were you going to say something? No? Okay.
Oh.
Anybody else on what knowledge that we've gained?
Actually, yes, Ellen, sorry. Based on what you showed us, and particularly with the VUCA video, which we've all seen in the bishop's office, there are just things we can do right now. We really need to tap into what is our mission and what can we do right now with, like you said, those people on the margins. I don't feel like we've been talking about that. And that's just a thought.
Thank you.
One thing that I've learned is that we definitely need to come together on a mission statement so that we can, and I don't think we have this kind of mission statement already nailed down.
Yeah, I think that the statement that we have really reflects, it's not a bad statement, but it just really reflects a different time.
Yeah.
And, you know, a very settled time. Nobody had any inkling that anything like this was going to happen. You know, so I think, yeah, to recast what we're about in 2020, 2021 and beyond, with this entirely different set of realities. If the mission statement is based on a boat, and we don't have a boat anymore, then we've got to come up with something else that's going to get us to the destination, whatever that might be.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to what's, yes, sorry.
I was just going to say, and it may come in another spot in our conversation. It just makes me think back on that. It was really powerful to me to see written down in this book that mission trumps everything, including denomination. And I think where that heads for me, I think I expressed this to Gary earlier, I think last week, is that I think there's a difference between being a Christian and that mission versus what the Episcopal Church, or more specifically Good Shepherd and Centennial, what our mission or mission statement as an organization. I think they definitely need to be related, but I think they may be two different things. And I think we need to be clear about what we're talking about what is our mission, where we are because of where we're located. There are certain things that, if we're talking about people on the margins, just aren't realistic for us to address given our location. Not that there aren't things that we can address. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm just saying what we might immediately think of may not be applicable to our setting. And that's something that I think we'll need to hash through as a group. What does that mean? What does that look like for us at Yosemite and Dry Creek and Centennial in the year 2020?
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that our margin, the Good Shepherd people on the margin, look different than perhaps the people on the margin in an inner city church. Is that
Perhaps.
accurate, Becky?
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not
Okay.
saying definitively. I'm just saying I think we need to be open to that and understand that there's two different senses of this word mission. Then we need to be clear about which sense we're talking about when we're using that term. Because to me, they're two different, related, but two different things.
Okay.
In
Deb?
that context, I serve on the board of Metrum Credit Union. Most of you know that. And we've been wrestling with how we serve the people of Centennial. And one of the things we've done is to decide to devote some of our, what used to be like neighborhood parties to encourage, people to think of Metrum Credit Union. We're devoting some of that money to food pantries. And so one of the things that I've been tasked with is to find out how many people at who are served by Covenant Cupboard come from Centennial, which is the target audience of Metrum Credit Union. And it has been eye-opening to the staff and board of how many people in Centennial are in food problems for the first time ever in their lives and don't have any idea what resources there are, if any.
Yeah, I think this is for another day and time, but this is going to be for some, a very uncomfortable process of discernment, because I do believe there are there's poverty, injustice in Centennial, people are hurting in Centennial and the surrounding areas. And for us who might think our mission is only worship or only making great music and things like that, I think this is going to be it's going to be a painful process of discernment for us.
I don't know if I'm understanding everything, particularly what Becky said, but just in terms of missional things, we're thinking about the boundaries that Jesus crossed. I don't think we have to just think of Centennial. I'm thinking bigger.
I'm hearing what you're saying, Diane, and we do reach out through St. Francis Sitter and Covenant Cupboard and the soup kitchen when those are all in operation, and we can do that. But there is a much greater need on our doorstep than I think we've ever admitted to. And because of our location, that's probably a good focus for training us to go out further. But, okay.
I would just jump in to say that I agree with everything that's been said. I absolutely agree, Mary and Becky, and I agree with all this. I wonder whether or not, though, we tend to turn quickly to what might be traditionally considered as marginalized, and whether or not there are other margins that we, I don't know what they might be, but what are some of the other margins? If you're in downtown situations, some of those margins are not necessarily the same margins that we have, and so what are the margins other than hunger or food insecurity? What are some of the other margins that face us that we might not immediately think of. And I don't know how we'll determine that, but I think we very quickly turn to one direction because that's been our history, rather than to say, well, we might need to look in a different direction.
I definitely agree with you, Gary. I've been saying to a lot of people that we have a huge mission to people who are like me, scared to death of getting this virus. We may be old, we may be sick, we may be both. And we are for the first time confronted with real fear of going beyond our front door. That's resulting in depression, and we don't know who to turn to. We have, although the Douglas County Sheriff's Office would deny it, we have a huge increase in domestic violence.
Douglas County Sheriff is verifying all that. They're not denying it.
Really? They were denying it to me.
Huh. Well, anyway, we won't get into that just because of the crisis center. But thank you, Gary, for explaining more eloquently than what I was trying to say.
Okay, well, let's look at what still doesn't make sense to us. And maybe some of what still doesn't make sense to us is who is on the margin. Can we capture that, Deb, so that we make sure that we get back to
Yeah, just
that?
a second. Okay.
Who's on our margin?
I don't know why I'm suddenly typing in red.
It's okay, you can type in whatever color you want.
Okay. There. Who is in the margin or our margin?
Our margin.
I heard something, but not clearly.
Our, that works.
Okay.
Anybody else have anything that doesn't make sense about what we've talked about for the last 5 weeks?
I'm not sure, maybe it's how do we use this new information that we've gotten from this book? How do we make this real?
Okay.
Sorry, how do we go from the book to reality?
Operationalizing the theory.
Yeah, I don't have that PhD, Gary. It's like, how do we get from the book to reality?
They're easier words to type.
Yeah. For me, all words are hard to type, but anyway.
Well, this gets, I think, a little bit to your question there, Deb. A sort of a similar way of thinking about it is that, you know, this book it had a particular audience, and we have a different audience reading the book than it's the one that it was written for. And I think one of the challenging things, I don't say it doesn't make sense, but one of the challenges we're going to face, or we need to face, is that in this COVID land, we are all leaders. And we can't, as somebody's already said, I think Susie may have said it earlier on, we can't just sit back and expect, you know, 1 or 11 people to take us forward. You know, it's going to be something that everybody has. And I keep going back to what Griffin said at the annual meeting. We have everything we need in this congregation. We still do. That hasn't changed. And so how do we, there is the how do we go from the book to reality, but how do we empower that leadership that is in everyone to sort of bubble up to the surface? You know, what we saw in the service 40 minutes ago, there's leadership there. I mean, that sermon was amazing. You know, and so how do we get that, you know, do the youth feel that they're on the margins? I mean, you want to talk about the margins that we have right in front of us. Do our young people feel that they're on the margins, and we need to learn from them rather than sort of starting outside off the property? You know, so where I think, yeah, how do we get the leadership in us to step up rather than assume that it's there and is going to do what it needs to do?
That's sort of like something that some of us have talked about in the process of developing our sessions for this book, is that there are how many of us on the vestry or on transition committee or whatever, and how many people offered to lead discussions?
Well, that could be a different skill set, so that's okay.
It could be, but I would hazard a guess that we've got more people with those skill sets than we're willing to step up and take their role.
Hey,
So how do
Deb.
we encourage that?
Hey, Deb, do you think this goes to that, and I can't find the page right quick. Do you think this goes to the author's point of that in churches, sometimes you'll have the governing body kind of keep the organization together, but you'll have a core of discovery go out? Do you think that metaphor applies here? I struggled with that. To your point.
Yeah, I think that comes as close as anything to what I'm talking about.
I think that part of what you're saying and what we're seeing, not just in the church, but in other aspects of our lives and society as well, is how do you get people to accept not just the authority of being the designated leader, but the responsibility? And how do you get that internal buy-in on a one-to-one basis that gets them to step forward and reach out and take that responsibility for some part of what's going on?
Well, and I think that we also have to give people permission to make mistakes. And we talked about that in the book as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have to give ourselves permission. Some things that we try are not going to work. They're just not. And some of us tend to be more perfectionists than others. And so when we think about leading something like this, or doing the reading this morning from Acts, okay? I can remember when my children were in 1st and 3rd grade, the associate priest asked them to do the Pentecost readings, okay, 1st and 3rd grade. And I said, sure. And I figured she was going to pick the readings out of a children's Bible where the words might be a little easier. And no, and like Gary said, most adults cringe at that reading. And yet our children are willing to stand up there, and if they mispronounce a word, who cares? And even, you know, trying to get lectors to understand that if you mispronounce a word, probably at least 90 to 95% of the congregation doesn't know that you said it wrong. You just keep going and forge on. We have to give ourselves permission to mess up.
Some of you know that I do sign language, and I have in the past been an ASL interpreter in church services. I hated this Sunday. It requires finger spelling.
Yeah.
That's just, all of that was finger spelling for every one of those names. Until I learned most interpreters sign lots of other people instead of the name.
That's funny.
So that's why I give ourselves permission to fail and try something new as an alternative.
I need to reiterate that we also, if we have a core of discovery out experimenting and trying things, one of the things that this book recommends is that we find somebody who doesn't feel lost, who is already on the margin to lead us. So finding that leader who is not part of us yet is one of the things that doesn't make sense, because I have no idea how we do it.
So that page, if you're on it, it's 165, if you care. It's in the box on 165, if anyone cares.
I think, Mary, I think whether it's a leader or whether it's a fellow, you know, a fellow traveler who has expertise or experience in that new world, you know, I mean, Sacagawea, whatever, you know, knew what was on the other side of Lemhi Pass. And so she became a fellow, a guide, a fellow, you know, traveler with a certain kind of expertise on that other side.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the issue. You know, it's not the academics saying, well, this is what young people want. This is finding the young people saying, this is what we want.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those, I agree with you. How do we find that person who isn't us to accompany us in creative ways?
So there's a fantastic story about Sacagawea that sort of fits into this image that we're using. When Lewis and Clark wanted to get the horses to go over the mountains, they were trying to approach, I think it was a Sioux tribe, and it turned out that one of the leaders of the Sioux tribe was actually Sacagawea's brother before she had been kidnapped and lived with the Mandans. So when they went into negotiations with the Sioux to get the horses, she translated the Sioux to her husband, who was a French trapper, and she translated it into French to him, and he translated it from French to English to the Corps. So there were 3 levels of translations going on, and I think that's what we need to do. We need to find the people who can do the translations for us and have that skill to kind of move us forward.
Okay, and I think we're moving to that, what's rubbing resistance, rubbing you wrong or creating resistance. But Mary started to say something.
I just want to, in the spirit of making mistakes, it's Shoshone, not Sioux.
Sorry, Mary, it's Nez Perce.
Oh, okay.
Well,
The Indians in Yellowstone. Okay.
Great.
there were a bunch of tribes.
Even better.
Yeah.
There were a bunch of tribes.
The Shoshone, however, claim Sacagawea these days.
The
Yeah,
Nez Perce.
He was
The
Western
Nez
Idaho,
Perce
Eastern Washington.
just claim her.
Okay.
So I'll start. It still kind of grates on my nerves that thinking about this is going to, thinking about changes is going to create this huge rift, if you will. Maybe there's a better word for that, but you know, that there's going to be some uprising. And that kind of bugs me, because I would think that we are educated people who care about each other and listen to each other, and so it shouldn't have to be like that. But that's not what Bolsinger says.
No, opponents, dissenters, casualties. You know, three of the 6 groups.
And look what happened to him.
To who? To Bolsinger?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
What happened? I don't know.
So he had a big plan, it was in the book.
Oh, yes.
He had a big plan in place, and there were a lot of dissenters, which is what Ellen is talking about.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a little bit like what we talked about last week with sabotage is a normal part of change. And in my experience, sabotage is an indication that people have not been brought along with that change. So it's a call to us to step back a bit and see where we've gone on without bringing everyone else with us.
I just want to sabotage the saboteurs.
Very Christian.
Honest.
I don't know that it's realistic to expect that everyone will want to come along. And how do we deal with the grief of some people making other choices?
It's a great question.
And in my experience, there are people you cannot bring along.
We have examples of that. I know of at least one when I was on the vestry, and we did the discernment that Bishop Rob asked in regards to same-sex blessings. This was before 2015. And we lost people because of that. We also gained people because of that.
I think we did experience grief that there were people who did not come along with us. I experience grief when I go to my Monday night Bible study of people who used to belong to Good Shepherd and no longer do.
I think one of the things that I'm guilty of this too is it's hard for us to take the long view, and that in the long view there's always going to be loss. You know, you can't help it. Sometimes it's going to be intentional loss. No, I can't go this direction. I've got to go. Or it may be the loss of a key individual through death or something like that. But the long view is that the church, whether it's the church or the Episcopal Church or Good Shepherd, is bigger than 2020, bigger than 2021, bigger than 2022. That really there is more to it. And so how do we get on, to use some of the language that I've heard, some of it's kind of in Bolsinger's book, but elsewhere, how do we get on board with God's mission that God will carry out, maybe in spite of us or our opponents or our dissenters. And you know, so I think it's really hard to take that long view. It's not necessarily in our character. It rubs us the wrong way, to use that title that you've got there.
Well, I think you have to understand too that part of being true to ourselves is that we are then have to allow others to be true to themselves as well, and their choices may well be different than ours.
I think one thing that COVID land, as Gary calls it, has taught us is that we're still the church, even though we're not doing worship the way we've always done it. And I think that may be one of the lessons that will be hardest for us to carry forward, in that as much as I think all of us on the screen that I'm looking at right now love our Episcopal worship, does it really speak to the larger world in drawing them into having a closer relationship to God and their neighbor? And it's heartbreaking to me to think that what I hold dear may go away, but if it doesn't serve the greater people, maybe we need to rethink what that means. And I know that probably that will ruffle a lot of feathers, especially because we're so centered on our worship in the Episcopal Church. But I wonder if that's one of the hard lessons, difficult lessons that we're learning through this period.
Well, I think, Becky, if we go back to the video we watched at the beginning, they talked about how community is more important than ever. And I think that one of the things we need to think about is how do we encourage and I'm not sure what other word I'm looking for, but there's another one too. How do we encourage community outside of Sunday morning worship, outside of formation like we're doing right now, outside of sheep count, outside of gabbing with Gary on Wednesdays? How do we encourage community? Because community, when you're part of community, that's not just a little snippet out of a day. Community, they're the people that are lifting you up when you can't lift yourself up. So how do we encourage and get people to feel that community, especially those of us who are living in houses with people that don't understand our Christian community? How do we move towards that? And I think we have to in this online world. We got to figure that out.
We certainly have to make somehow our church not our building. This is our school is no longer, our kids' school is no longer their building. It's their class, it's their lessons, it's whatever. And I think we're all going to have to learn to reach out. Our office is no longer necessarily a building. It's a little corner of the desk or a place that you've got your computer set or whatever. It's where your office suddenly becomes. And so we're going to have to learn how to not just reach out to others, but open ourselves to allow others to accept us where we are, and for us to accept others where they are, which is not inside a building, inside a formal service, inside a set of constraints.
Hey, Deb, can you capture that on the next slide?
The next slide.
Is what we need to start to do differently.
Okay.
And I think Dan, that's a great point of something that we need to figure out what it looks like to have the church not be the building, and to meet people where they are and where we are. So what else do you think we need to start to do differently?
I think we have to learn how to talk in a different language. A more, for one of a better word, a secular language. So we need to learn how to translate between Sacagawea's language and French and English conceptually.
So maybe we need to learn the language of the people on our margins.
Even the language that's not on our margins. I mean, this was part of why I taught the sacraments class the way that I taught it, was to say that what we are doing religiously, liturgically, is really addressing basic human needs, and we've translated that into church speak. So we do Eucharist when really it's a common meal. We do baptism when really it's initiation. We do these things and we call them religious things. And I think learning how to unreligiositize, now there's a word, our language,
Spell that.
it becomes real. People gather together to eat meals in all sorts of places because they want to be with those folks. They don't call it church, but it's church, and so how do we, I think you're right in terms of that translation piece. I don't think it needs to be the margins. I think it needs, in some respects, to be the majority language, because in that regard, we're on the margin if we talk about, to go back to some of the things that Becky was talking about, what we might be losing because of what's going on. What we might be losing is that Episcopal peculiarity. And that's hard to let go of because we like reading, marking, learning, and inwardly digesting things, but nobody else gets that reference. Are there ways that we can really speak the language that is out there in general without having to go to, just the language of the margins?
I think
Well,
we need to quit thinking of them as margins.
Yeah.
Because we're the margin.
Just recognize the fact that as those of us who are churched, be it Episcopalian or whatever, we are on the margins of an otherwise secular world in a lot of ways. So in many respects, we are a margin for many others.
I
And
think
just maybe that realization.
I think also we need to go out and meet our neighbors, just like Canon Alex told the vestry at our retreat. He told the story of a church just going out, knocking on doors. I mean, I'm not saying we have to do that literally, but he used that as an example. Go out and meet the neighbors and understand who they are and what their needs are. So when we talk about Centennial as our mission field and that sort of thing, I don't think we really have an idea of who our neighbors are. Now, for me, this has been messed up by COVID because I was going out and meeting our neighbors in nursing homes in the area, and I will not be able to continue that ministry for a very long time. I was going out meeting with people, talking to them. I was starting to do godly play with dementia people with dementia. So now I'm going to have to sort of figure out what that ministry will be in the future, but definitely going out and knowing who our neighbors are. And neighbor can be Centennial, can be Colorado, it could be just our neighbors as Jesus describes his neighbors, the people that the unknown, the other.
I wonder how many of us visit, say hello, how are you doing, to any of the folks attending AA meeting in the morning or the SA meeting at noon, inviting them to come and worship with us or be with us, be comfortable with us. I think that the evening service is extremely comfortable and not overly liturgical if that's something somebody is upset with. We also gave up the pumpkin patch, which really had a potential for our neighborhood. And I know I shared with Rachel getting some flyers together for our youth group to go to the neighborhood around us, because many of them did come to the pumpkin patch, about the pumpkin patch being there. And we always gave them the brochures on the mission as well as what our church does. And there were many people who gave because they liked what we did. So the mission doesn't necessarily have to be grandiose. We have a population I'm not sure we've ever touched. I fold bulletins, so when I'm there every other Thursday, I'm always saying hello to the folks who come in at about 11 o'clock in the morning. So I think sometimes we don't realize what we already have in our building. I think the HOA for the development next to us meets in our building. I don't know if we've ever said hello to those people and invited them to come worship with us. So it's not as if it has to be grandiose, I don't think, but I don't know how much we've really done with what we already have.
That's a good point. And maybe all it would take is, especially at an HOA meeting, is for one of us to be there as a representative, just to welcome them to the building and say, we're here, and if you ever want to come worship with us, here's our information. Small things.
But maybe also, instead of saying, we're here, come join us, how can we serve you? What can we do to help your community? Rather than what can we do to get you in our building? It's how do we get out of our building and offer a service to the community around us?
I think right now, since we can't invite anybody into our building anyway,
Yeah.
that question is pretty potent, and will be for quite a while. But I agree. The issue is not to pack more people inside the doors. The issue is to take what we have inside the doors to the people. And for some, that may be worship. It may be
I
that.
don't know how many of the people who attend AA or SA are financially hurting because they've lost jobs and it can't work, like many of the tradespeople are not allowed to work yet, and don't even know about Covenant Covered or could use some help. I don't know that. And I know we all have a contact person. So possibly getting in touch with AA and SA and saying that, you know, we'd like to reach out if people need help in the organizations that use our church. That would be a suggestion I can make.
I'm curious, is there a sign on the outside of our church about information about Covenant Covered? If people they come to the church trying to find help?
No.
No.
It's a great idea, Kathy. One of the things I was thinking about is because we've been worried about the Zoom bombers, we have our worship services password protected. And is there a way, or do we just say, okay, we're just gonna trust that we're not gonna get Zoom bombed and open it up? I don't know the answer to that either. But
I have a suggestion. I don't know what the sign at the curb says these days, but you know, if you're interested in attending, call or contact this person, and you know, that kind of thing.
What it says right now is it just says, for information, go to the website.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering with the Zoom bombing, and now that we are more comfortable with Zoom, I wonder if it's really any different than someone physically coming into one of our church services and carrying on and yelling or doing what has happened occasionally throughout history, and the ushers gently escort them out. Is there a way to block one user, Gary? I don't know about that.
I mean, there are a couple of things. One is, you know, and some of the Zoom bombing, it'd be interesting to know how often that happens anymore. Once the Zoom has put in a whole lot of restrictive things. But, you know, certainly as the host, and we've got, I always designate a co-host. The co-host can remove people. The host or the co-host can just remove people. One of the settings that's now kind of default is, and I think you've experienced this, Becky, is that only the host can decide whether or not screens can be shared.
Which, by the way, we are still having that same issue this last Tuesday.
Well, somebody has to sign in as the host. There has to be a host.
Oh, because I just click on the link. Oh, anyway,
Yeah.
we'll talk about that offline.
Yeah.
But the point is, now, you know, I can set it, or the host can set it so only the host can share a screen. That's a new, you know, if Zoom bombers can go in and they can't share, then that's shot. If everybody is muted, that's kind of shot. And so, you know, it may be time to rethink whether or not we want to make some of that access a little more free, and then just deputize a co-host to say, okay, it's your job to keep these people out. What I have to do now is to tell the co-host, these are the people who legitimately should be speaking during the service. Don't mute them again.
The other thing we could look at is the possibilities of the, there's a term for it, I can't remember, a lobby. You can use a lobby.
Waiting room.
A waiting room. And I don't know the full capabilities of the waiting room, but that might be a place while you're in the waiting room, you're watching the video about our church that we did at the the day of the church picnic. It was actually on Pentecost, what, 3 years ago? That might be something to consider.
I personally think we could do a better one, a better introduction to the congregation.
Yeah, but that one exists.
Yeah, I don't know if that's possible in the waiting room, but you know, it's worth checking.
Yeah.
Does anybody else think of something we need to start doing differently right now?
Again, I think we need to get our mission together so we have more specific things to address.
8 words, right, Gary?
That's the one I like. I mean, I just think that it has some nice advantages to it, but I'm not the only one who has an opinion about the 8 words. So
8-ish words. How
Yeah.
about that?
ish.
All right, so moving forward, some things for you to think about with someone that you trust. What more do you need to learn? What losses do we need to face or prepare ourselves to face in order to keep going? We all know that we never stop learning, and Lewis and Clark gave us that great example by going 2 different routes home because they wanted to learn more. And so what do we need to learn? And this is something that we just need to think about. We need to be lifelong learners. We need to model that behavior for each other and for our kids. And we need to understand that as we move forward, things are going to change. I mean, they've already changed. And like Becky said, the loss of potentially some of our Episcopalianness in our services.
Most sacred cows.
You know, losses that we might need to face. And so we have to prepare ourselves because for many of us, that would be difficult. So think about those questions with someone that you trust and can talk honestly about them. And then for practice of embodying leadership transformation, find your balcony. You know, we need to see the big picture. We can't look at life through a tiny little lens and say that that's what life looks like. We need to be able to see the big picture, be a mentee for someone, and figure out where we need to go from here. And I think we talked about a lot of that. Sorry, Deb.
I have a resource that I really want to share with you, and I know you probably don't want to read another big long book about exploration, but there's a book called The Last Place on Earth, and it was about 2 different explorers who went to the South Pole. Britain's Robert Scott and Norway's Roald Amundsen. The British guy did exploration the way they'd always done exploration, by golly, by gum. The other guy said, you know, if I'm going to go to the South Pole, I need to practice in similar environments so that I gain the skills and some knowledge about how to traverse these resources. So he did a lot of exploration in Norway and Iceland and Greenland and places like that, and learned that dogs work better for this than they do for this, and if they die, they're actually a source of food. You know, things like that. Whereas the British guy didn't ever modify. He never modified. His entire party died. The Norwegian party made it to the South Pole. It's a really, really good book about how you modify your normal way of doing things to accommodate your environment. So I commend to you that book called The Last Place on Earth. It's by Paul Thoreau. The introduction was by Paul Thoreau. The author was Roland Huntford. It's about Scott and Amundsen, their race to the South Pole. Really an interesting thing to look at about adaptability and change.
Thanks, Deb. And thank you, everybody, for being part of this this exploration season. And you will notice that in that thank you slide, Deb's not going to leave it up there, but she didn't put her name on there as our tech person. But thanks to all the presenters and our tech people and all of you for being part of the discussion.
Indeed. Thank you all. Go out and be leaders.
Yeah.
And we'll see you in a little while driving by the church.
And thanks for coming to this class. Those of you who came and shared, whether, what is the phrase? Shared, whether verbally or silently. Yeah.
I
All
think,
good.
I think we would be remiss if today, especially